Now we're going to be looking at CSS essentials, content flow, positioning and styling. The agenda is a little bit of an intro about cascading style sheets, then we're going to be looking at selectors and declarations, then fonts and font families, then a bit about content flow, then positioning, and then looking at content overflow and different ways to deal with that. Okay, so cascading style sheets is a language that defines how HTML elements are styled. So HTML structures a document while CSS formats it. CSS can be applied to single HTML elements, or it can be kept in a separate file and applied to elements throughout a document. Files that hold CSS are called style sheets and use the .css extension. It should be noted that usually the CSS would be in a separate file. Unlike HTML, CSS uses rules instead of tags. So CSS3 is the version of CSS that was released in conjunction with HTML5. So CSS3 always associated with HTML5. CSS3 is backward compatible, which means it can be used with older versions of HTML and CSS. And there are a number of new effects in CSS3, including 2D and 3D transformations, as well as animations. So how do you link the CSS with the HTML file? There's three ways to do this. The first is with inline styling. You can see the example there on the right hand side. So this would be included within the actual HTML file itself. Okay, so you just, for example, using the P tag, you might specify the style of the text to be read. The second method of incorporating CSS into HTML is by use of the style element nested in the head element. Again, this is within the HTML file. Okay, so number 2 on the right hand side there, you can see that you have that style element, specifying the rule for the H1 heading. Okay, so to use that particular font family and the color specified there. Okay, so those first two methods incorporate the styling, as I say, into the HTML file. The third element, and the most common one, is by using the link element and a separate CSS file. So the link element would actually be within the head in the HTML, but you would have a separate file located somewhere, usually on the same server, and you would specify the location of that using href, okay, as you can see in the third example on the screen. One of the great advantages of having CSS in a separate file is the ease with which you can update the style of the page. So you can make any changes required to the appearance and the styling of the website within that external CSS file, and then those changes will then apply across the website to any pages which link to that CSS file. So this page really just sort of recaps the way of linking HTML and CSS files. Okay, so you can use the link element for linking them, and the href attribute points to the location of the CSS file. Okay, it's obviously important that the file name and location are correct, or none of the style will be applied. The rel attribute should be set as style sheet, while the type attribute should be set as text/CSS, okay, as you can see in the example below there. Next up, let's have a look at selectors and declarations. So there's two parts to a CSS rule. The first part is the selector, and the second part is the declaration. As you can see at the bottom of the page there, H1 in this particular example is the selector, whereas the declaration includes both the property and the value. The selector references the HTML element that you want to style. So in this case it's the H1 element. The declaration is the style that you want to apply to that element. The declarations, as you said, have two parts: a property followed by a colon and a space, and a value followed by a semicolon. The declarations sit between curly brackets. IDs and classes. So HTML elements can be referenced by selectors in a number of ways, including the following. So you can use a tag name, such as H1 as we saw in the previous example, or table, or P. Now that's in the first example at the top of the right hand side there. You can also use an ID selector. Okay, as we can see in the second example, we have the example of navbar. So you include a hashtag symbol as a prefix to the selector name. And thirdly, we can use class selectors such as .happy, as you can see in the third example there, and that includes a decimal point as a prefix. ID and class are both known as universal attributes, so they can apply to any element. Okay, so ID is used to identify a unique element on the page, whereas class should be used to categorize elements into groups that will be styled similarly. And we'll see the importance and the relevance of this as we progress into further lessons. So comments. You can add comments to your CSS file in order to help to explain what the CSS actually does. Okay, it will also make your code easier for others to read and understand. You can add a multi-line comment by starting with the / characters, then ending with the * characters. Anything between those characters won't be interpreted by a browser. Okay, so you have examples there on the right hand side. Next up, we're looking at fonts and font families. A font is a set of characters of a particular size and style. You've got three examples there underneath. Okay, so Times New Roman, Arial and Courier. So the primary way to specify fonts in CSS is by using the font family property. Three common types of fonts are serif, sans serif and monospace. You can see the description of each in that table. Okay, the font face rule. So prior to CSS3, developers had to use fonts that were installed on a user's device. Those fonts were known as web safe, and as you could be pretty much guaranteed that any computer would have those fonts installed on it. However, there was a very limited number of font choices that were available to developers, and so the font face rule in CSS3 was brought in to allow developers to use any font as long as it is located on their web server. Okay, and you can see how the font face rule is implemented there. Okay, so it's just at font face, and then you specify the font family and the URL of the file location basically for that font. You obviously need to make sure that you've got legal permission to use that font. There are sort of free to use fonts available, but even then you should make sure that you would have permission to use it for commercial purposes, and normally you would have to purchase the font. Next up, we're going to be looking at content flow. Flow is a display style in HTML that focuses on filling content on a page horizontally in rows from top to bottom. You can see an example of block flow on the right hand side and underneath inline. So with block flow, content is placed on its own line above or below other content. it fills the line from left to right. With inline flow, content fits on the same line with other content before or after it. So you can see image or IMG, for example, are then by default will be placed inline, and you can sort of see how it's how that is demonstrated on the page there. Whereas with block, it is placing the content on its own line. Okay, so a new element is placed underneath the previous one. Next up, we're going to be looking at positioning. Floating elements. So in addition to modifying the flow of a page, HTML and CSS also allow developers to position individual HTML elements. The float property allows you to move an element all the way to the left or to the right of a page. Other content will then wrap around the floated content. The value of float is commonly set to left or right. So you can see on the screen there, the blue paragraph is floated to the left, whereas the green paragraph has been floated to the right. Clearing a float. So the clear property can be used to prevent other floating elements from touching the left or the right hand side of an element. The value of the clear property can be left, right, both, or none. So left clears the left side, right clears the right side, i.e. ensuring that no other content would touch the right hand side of the element, and both clears both sides. None allows other elements to touch. I think it's worth having a look at W3 Schools at the float property and experimenting a little bit with it on the website, because it would help to sort of clarify how floats work and specifically how clearing a float works. Okay, so that is the link that you can use in order to do that. Okay, or just Google it. The position property allows you to place an element at specific locations within a document. The values commonly used with the position property are the following. We have static, which positions an element within its normal flow. Relative positions an element in relation to where it would normally be positioned in the flow of content. Absolute ensures that the positioning of an element doesn't impact other content. And fixed positions an element in relation to the browser window and stays in the same place. Next up, we're looking at content overflow. The bounding box. Every HTML element on a page occupies a rectangular space called a bounding box. You can think of text with a highlighted background on a Word document or a web page. With CSS, you can modify the height or the width of that bounding box. If an element doesn't fit inside of its bounding box, then that content is called overflow. You can see this on the image on the right hand side of the page. You can modify how the overflow content is styled using the overflow property in CSS. Understanding scrolling overflow. If you set the overflow property's value to scroll, then all of the content in an element will stay within the bounding box. None of the overflow will appear outside of the box. This will allow users to use scroll bars within the box to view all of the content. This is the same type of scrolling you experience on a web page or in a web app. Understanding visible overflow and hidden overflow. With visible overflow, overflow content will spill outside of the bounding box and potentially overlap with other elements. Implement visible overflow by using the overflow property's visible value. In contrast, hidden overflow will make any content outside of the bounding box invisible. Implement hidden overflow by using the overflow property's hidden value. You can see an overflow demo in your book, and again you can also look at it on W3 Schools for more interactive examples, and I would suggest actually doing it that way. A quick summary of what we've looked at. So we've looked at a bit of an intro to CSS, then we looked at selectors and declarations and the different types, then we looked at fonts and font families, content flow, positioning, and finally content overflow and how that is dealt with.